Leave it now.
Leave it. It's not worth it.
Right, people.
Walk away. Don't make me drop my chips.
Yo, B, I'm out of here.
What's happening, fool? Yeah, yo.
We've been lost profits.
We've been lost profits. Big up.
In the house.
Respect. I got 21 seconds to go. Let me never tell about the ragamuffin business on King. Go on then, Merlin. Fast.
Their name was taken from a Duran Duran live bootleg, and they grew up listening to The Cure, The Police, Iron Maiden and New Order. They come from Wales, and they're called Lost Prophets. This is their story. For most kids growing up in poor suburban towns or remote rural areas, there are few opportunities to express themselves creatively, particularly if it so happens that they don't feel they fit into mainstream society, with its many rites, rituals and life-denying black holes of social and economic opportunity. The members of Lost Prophets are luckier than most. They grew up in the same town, went to the same schools, played in the same bands and suffered the same feelings of isolation and despair when it came to their teenage years. They are self-proclaimed freaks and misfits, who found it hard, if not impossible, to make sense of the few opportunities that life had to offer them in their hometown environment. While this might be a slightly exaggerated account of their feelings, it probably rings true for a lot of people. Growing up in a place like Pontypridd, wonderful though it may be if you like that sort of thing, is hardly an inspiration for creating a top-flight rock band and setting out to rule the world. Yet according to the laws of possibility, it has as much chance of coming true here as any other seemingly remote and fanciful dream. And Lost Prophets are the living proof. Growing up on a diet of 1980s pop, independent rock, heavy metal, hardcore and US post-punk, Lost Prophets have a self-proclaimed eclecticism that means they are both bang up to date and hard to classify. Essential if you don't want to end up becoming a victim of genre stereotyping. As one of Britain's few successful nu metal bands, they have had to suffer being repeatedly told that Americans have the upper hand when it comes to music of this kind. Oh yeah? Who says? Lost Prophets would almost certainly disagree. They have defied the odds and proved that accepted wisdom is not always correct.
Brandon Boyd.
Brendan Boyd.
He's so lush.
I tell you what, to everybody, this is for everyone who might be listening, it was Brandon himself, right, that didn't want us on this Incubus tour. and I know this for a fact because, well, I don't know if for a fact, I'm making it up, but because he told his brother to tell his sister's friends, auntie, uncle, who's so related to my...
There has always been a certain amount of antagonism between the English and the Celts. In the first 1,000 years or so of Britain's history, the island was invaded 3 times. First came the Romans, bringing hot baths and straight roads. Then came the Saxons, bringing new farming technology and the basis of the language we now call English. Finally, the French landed in Hastings in 1066, and the rest, so goes the cliché, is history. But by that time, the original native population of what became known as Britain, the Celts, had been forced by the Anglo-Saxons to leave their homes and flee. The invaders grabbed the best bit, now known as England, for themselves, and chased the people whose lands they were invading into the more remote, mountainous and inhospitable corners of the island. The areas they settled in are now known as Wales, Scotland and Cornwall. Think of Wales, and you might think of rain, rugby, choir singing, Charlotte Church, former Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock, and Tom Jones. Tom was a bona fide 1960s pop sensation who stunned female audiences with his raw masculinity. If his singing style could be said to lack subtlety, this was nothing compared to what looked like a 12-inch lead pipe stuffed down his trousers. And for a while, if you thought of Wales and thought pop or rock, Tom Jones seemed to be the only name that came to mind. But then, during the 1990s, with the exception of Charlotte Church, a nightmare schoolgirl dominatrix with £1 million in her back pocket, Wales suddenly became hip. First came the Manic Street Preachers, then Feeder, Stereophonics and Super Furry Animals. And then, roaring out of the suburbs and straight into the pages of music magazines up and down the land, came everyone's favourite 6-piece nu metal hot contenders from Pontypridd, Lost Prophets. The band was formed in 1997 from the splinters of Public Disturbance, an earlier, post-hardcore outfit that already contained the nucleus of the group that would in the future set them on the road to international fame. This tightly bound central core was composed of 3 young men who had been friends since childhood: Ian Watkins, Lee Gaze and Mike Lewis. Ian was the drummer in Public Disturbance. Mike and Lee were its 2 guitarists. Ian was born in Merthyr, but moved to Pontypridd with his mum shortly after his dad died. His mum was a Black Sabbath fan, and rock music was a constant presence in the Watkins household. This legendary and notorious early 1970s hard rock group was supposed to be one of the darkest, most dangerous bands on the planet. Their early songs, artwork and album covers owed a good deal of their imagery to the equally legendary bad boy of Victorian anti-religion, Aleister Crowley. In real life, of course, Black Sabbath were not the harbingers of the coming apocalypse, but 4 working-class lads from the West Midlands of Britain who invented something even more powerful than any suburban antichrist: the heavy rock riff. Together with Deep Purple and the massively popular Led Zeppelin, whose guitarist Jimmy Page was also an enthusiast of Aleister Crowley, Sabbath gave birth to a genre of popular music that would inspire generations of guitar bands to come. Less fortunately, they also inspired a fashion for dirty flared jeans and grey trench coats, which, happily, were consigned to the rubbish bin of fashion history once punk rock came along. And somewhere between heavy metal and punk came the eventual inspiration for the new metal bands of the 1990s.
Yeah, we will.
It's an octave.
Da-da,
Who
da-da,
will it be?
da-da.
Like a... But not in tune,
Why?
obviously.
I like that I live.
My mother,
Sorry.
my father, I love him.
I hate him.
In all the textbooks, it says quite clearly that if you want to be a rock star, you must first master 3 chords on the guitar, then learn to do everything to excess, including biting the head off a chicken live on stage. Unless, of course, you're Ozzy Osbourne, in which case you can graduate to bats. Drinking, smoking, owning your own private pharmacy, and having sex in the back of the tour bus with girls only barely over the legal age are also absolutely fundamental to the apprentice rock god. On the other hand, if you're Ian Watkins, you might just stick to trying cider in your early teens, find that it's disgusting, and give up drinking altogether from then on. Millions of fans of the hard-rocking, drinking man's top band Motorhead would disagree, of course, as both they and their motorcycles have been running on something resembling home-brewed cider for years. But then, Motorhead enthusiasts are unique in the curious world of rock fandom. Ian also developed a similar distaste for smoking, so he can hardly be considered a prototype rock star in the old-school sense of the word. In the postmodern age, confounding expectations have become an essential part of the media biz game, and in some quarters, taking drugs, smoking, and losing the plot on a regular basis have become distinctly uncool. And anyway, who really wants to end up barking mad in a rehab centre? Just ask Ozzy Osbourne. But perhaps at the core of Lost Prophet's extraordinary success lies the fact that their combined roots go back a long way. Ian has known rhythm guitarist Mike Lewis since nursery school, and he and guitarist Lee Gaze have been virtually inseparable since their early teens, sharing their mutual fanaticism for music and always playing together in the same bands. These included Fleshbind and Aftermath, which formed in 1990, and then Public Disturbance, where they first teamed up with Mike Lewis. Coming from a small town, it was almost inevitable that they would get to know most of the other musicians in their area, and Ian and Lee were no exceptions. By the time they formed Lost Prophets, they'd encountered Jamie Oliver, Mike Chiplin and Stuart Richardson on numerous occasions in the throbbing subterranean rock venues in and around Pontypridd in the mid-1990s. Like Ian, Lee Gaze also started out as a drummer, but gave it up as it was impossible to practice at home. Born in Pontypridd, he, like any good rock musician, got his initial taste for pop music from the records his parents listened to at home. Lee spent many happy hours entranced by his dad's collection of 1980s pop and rock, and groups like The Cure, The Police and Joy Division formed the basis of his musical education. Both Ian and Lee went on to higher education after they left school. Only Ian finished his course, getting a degree in graphic design. Lee enrolled for a media studies course but left before completing it. His obsession was music. Nothing else really counted. It was music or nothing. Drummer Mike Chiplin started out on his musical life as a guitarist and travelled in the opposite direction to Ian and Lee, ending up as a drummer. Although born in Cardiff, he came to Pontypridd when his father, a former steelworker, became a priest and was offered a ward there. As a die-hard rock fan, Mike counts Iron Maiden, Anthrax and Metallica among his all-time greatest loves and influences. When he first moved to Pontypridd, it seemed like a lost world compared to the more cosmopolitan Cardiff. But after a few nights checking out the local music scene, he landed on his feet when he met up with Ian and Lee, who at that time were playing in Fleshbind. Later, after Public Disturbance had fallen apart, Mike had already decided to ditch the guitar and become a drummer. A lucky twist of fate got him in a session sitting in with Ian and Lee. He hasn't looked back since. As the oldest member of the band and father of 3 children, Mike gave up drinking and smoking to concentrate on staying healthy enough to enjoy the hectic schedule of life in a successful rock band. He rejected the old-school rock and roll ideal of partying hard and dying young in favour of being there for his kids when they get older. So much for rock and roll excess. Welcome to the new age.
Pretty soon we'll be ashes. Yeah, we got with 3 tour buses each. We roll with 12 tour buses.
Very often, if you ask a member of a band where they got their inspiration from in the first place and what drove them to join a band, the answer will be the same: boredom. Sometimes the rot sets in at school, where a feeling of being different might set you off on a different path to those around you. Once you've got that sense, it's very hard to shake it off. And when people begin to ask you what you're going to do once you leave school, it can seem like there's really very little to say. And a place like Pontypridd, with the greatest respect, is hardly the most cosmopolitan place on earth. So if you have this feeling of being something of an outsider, or having a nagging suspicion that you have something to say that can't easily be said working in a bank, or in a shop, or in some other dead-end job where the only release is getting off your face at weekends, it can be hard to figure out what to do. For Ian Watkins, it may have been more a sense of wanting to get out and have fun, making the kind of music he liked to hear, that led him to become the drummer with Public Disturbance. Determined to get themselves a life doing what they loved most, the band toured diligently around Britain, making lots of contacts, but finally having to admit defeat when it became clear that Public Disturbance were not going to hit the big time. When it came to forming Lost Prophets, it was assumed that Ian would be the drummer, as his shyness had prevented him, thus far, from being considered front man. But the truth was that whatever his strengths as a drummer may have been, he was an excellent vocalist and would turn out to be an unbeatable front man. His natural integrity and lack of pretentiousness would confirm this. So he and Lee decided they would look for a new Sticksman. Enter Mike Chiplin. All they needed to complete the classic 4-piece rock band now was a bass player. Ian, Lee and Mike had known each other a long time, since they were young children, so it would have been hard for any newcomer to break through the bond that held them together. In the end, it proved impossible. After a short time, it became clear that taking on board a relative stranger was not going to work. And it was then they turned to the solution that had probably been staring them in the face all along. Although Mike Lewis had fronted Public Disturbance as a guitarist, the move to bass was an easy transition to make. Lost Prophets now had a bass player, one who they knew and trusted. Fortunately, it was a formula that worked, for the time being at least. There would be changes to come in the future, but for now the important thing was to get out there and do all the things that recently formed bands are supposed to do: write songs, get gigs, and record some demos. Maybe it's just as well that when bands like Lost Prophets start out, they have such determination that they don't let the odds against them deter them. On the face of it, being a band from a nondescript town in Wales and wanting to make the kind of music normally made by American bands like Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, or any of the bewildering plethora of new metal bands around, might not be the best career option. On the other hand, when the best career option going is no career option at all, it makes perfect sense. And for all those who think that being in a new metal band is a simple matter of making a trip to the local surf and skate shop for those essential baggy pants, claiming that Black Sabbath is your favourite band, or that you think that all teen pop, and Britney Spears in particular, is total crap, there may be some bad news. Having good songs is actually the most important bit. If you've got that and the right amount of determination to succeed, you might just be in with a chance. Just ask Lost Prophets. They began with all the odds stacked against them and proved that it could be done. But back in 1997, what they needed most was a break. No matter how good your band is, it's no good having your friends and family listen once to the demo CD you've made and then toss it in the kitchen drawer, never to be seen again. You need to break out of that restrictive, dead-end scene and get out in the real world, where you need to convince someone, somewhere, that what you have is solid gold and nothing less. And happily for Lost Prophets, they did just that.
Yeah, the squirrel was a knob. Nobody seems to realise that.
He ate all our food, drank all our beer.
Yeah, and he didn't have a leg.
He took up the whole
This plastic squirrel we had.
He took up the whole of the lounge sofa, so nobody could sit down and watch any of the movies.
By his own admission, Ian had no idea how to structure songs when Lost Prophets were working first on their initial demos and then on their debut LP. These things come with time, and time brings maturity. But maturity is the natural enemy of that raw, unsophisticated, first-time-out spontaneity that made the original garage punk bands like MC5 so compelling. It was true, too, of the British punk of the mid-1970s. Maybe it was that lack of artifice or self-consciousness that the band managed to cram into Here Comes the Party, the first demos that so impressed Metal Hammer magazine and prompted them to give Lost Prophets 10 out of 10 in their first major review. As Ian has since remarked in interviews, the band featured at that time a sax player and a DJ, whose job was to provide scratching and other non-musical elements. If it was seen later to be a transitional phase for the band, their response would most likely be that they always play the music that they like, whatever that might mean at the time. From there, it was a short journey to the pages of rock magazine Kerrang, who were similarly bowled over by this jet-propelled message in a bottle from the Welsh valleys. So much so, in fact, they were given a slot on a Kerrang-sponsored gig. This in turn brought them to the attention of Visible Noise, an independent British record label devoted to championing new bands away from the strictures of the mainstream. For their first officially recorded song, the band would use the name that has since become synonymous with their emergence from obscurity. The Fake Sound of Progress was not only the title of a 7-inch vinyl single, backed with a demo called Happy New Year, Have a Great 1985, but was used again for their first major album release on Visible Noise. This was to be the original version of the album, containing 16 songs recorded in a single session during 2000 on a budget of £4,000. Their original lineup, with Mike Lewis on bass, had been a useful stopgap when no better solution had presented itself. But now it became clear that if they were going to not only record an album, but to tour as well, they needed Mike back on guitar to provide the sonic power needed on stage. They now needed a permanent bass player. To this end, Lost Prophets recruited Stuart Richardson, who would not only play bass, but would also play the essential role of the band's token drinker, until Jamie Oliver would turn up a year from then. It wasn't that Stuart would stop drinking, just that Jamie would prove he knew how to do it to a more professional, perhaps even industrial, standard. Stuart was born in Ferndale, a village a few miles up the Rhondda Valley from Pontypridd, where he spent the first 18 years of his life developing a healthy distaste for Ferndale and everything about it. At the age of 6, he began to play the acoustic guitar, but soon abandoned it through lack of real interest. At 13, he became a rock fan, his particular favourites being Iron Maiden, Red Hot Chili Peppers and Faith No More. As everyone he knew played guitar, he decided to be different and learned to play bass. As things turned out, it was an inspired move. The core members of Lost Prophets had known Stewart from the Pontypridd music scene. He was the natural choice to replace Mike Lewis. The original version of The Fake Sound of Progress was released in November 2000 under the catalogue number Torment 05. For a first release on an independent label, it was remarkably successful, selling a total of 140,000 copies in the UK alone. By 2001, they had been feted in Kerrang as Best Newcomers. Also by then, they had come to the attention of the weekly British rock paper, the NME, who offered readers the chance to appear in the band's first video to accompany the release of their first mainstream single, Shinobi vs Dragon Ninja, to be released on November 19th, 2001. But before this, there was to be a remixed and resequenced version of the first album. Sony, who had taken on distribution for Visible Noise, felt that the original mix was unsuitable for mass-market consumption, bringing Lost Prophets to their first run-in with the real world of corporate financed rock. Feeling that the album lacked those qualities that it takes for mainstream product to appeal to as wide an audience as possible, Sony insisted on certain changes. You can react to this in two ways. Either you can take the view that if you sign with a powerful global corporation like Sony, you are bound to end up being processed accordingly. Or you can decide that what you have to say is what you have to say, that you're going to do it your way, and those who don't like it can, essentially, fuck off and die. The unhappy facts of life are that most people with any regard for ambition and career progress are going to opt for the corporate makeover. This is going to lead to accusations of a sellout from those fans who always like to claim afterwards that they were there from the start and can remember the band when they were still purists. That is all very well, but if the idea is to make any kind of progress and, in the case of Lost Prophets, get the hell out of Pontypridd, it's crystal clear which choice should be made.
We're doing Ozfest in the UK. Yeah, did I say UK? I meant US. But we're doing that all summer, so it should be really, really good.
Jamie Oliver, who bears no relation to the annoying celebrity male cook of the same name, was born in Kilfinnid, a few miles from Pontypridd. In his early teens, he was often to be seen wandering the streets with a pocket camera, taking pictures and then painting them up on canvas later. In this way, he earned a place on a fine arts degree course at Bristol University. Just as he was considering a postgraduate course at Cardiff, a call came from some old friends. Jamie had known the members of Lost Prophets from his teenage years in Pontypridd and almost ended up being their vocalist. He had played bass guitar in a few local bands, but had decided to concentrate on art rather than music. But, as so often is the case in life, just when you think you've got it all figured out, fate intervenes. In this case, it came in the guise of a phone call from Ian Watkins. For the original sessions for The Fake Sound of Progress, the band had been booked into a recording studio in Birmingham. That was fine, but there was a problem. None of them had any transport. Enter Jamie Oliver, a man with a car. So the trip was on, and a few weeks later, all involved had had such a good time that Jamie was invited to act as band photographer. Visible Noise objected to this arrangement on the grounds that they couldn't afford to pay anybody who was not a proper band member. In response to this, Jamie was packed off to get a pair of turntables and an electronic keyboard, and a week later, he was a fully fledged member of the Lost Prophets. On January the 26th, 2002, Lost Prophets arrived in Dublin to play at the inaugural night of the NME Carling Awards tour. According to accounts written at the time, a splendid time was had by all. Opening that night were the then relatively unknown The Coral. Other performers included the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club and Andrew WK, whom Mike Lewis immortalised in an interview with Music.com as an utter wanker. In a subsequent interview, he seemed to contradict himself by claiming that Andrew WK was a really nice person. Maybe burgeoning success had confused him. Or maybe the band's press officer had to remind him that speaking your mind when being interviewed was not always the best policy. A few weeks later, the Lost Prophets proceeded the final night of the tour in London with a short set in the Virgin Megastore on Oxford Street, where they signed copies of the remixed Faked Sound of Progress album. Autumn 2001 and spring 2002 saw a frenzy of activity as the band's various recordings were remixed and released in a variety of formats. In November 2001, Shinobi vs. Dragon Ninja had been released as both a 3-track CD single and as a 7-inch single, with Miles from Nowhere on the B-side. A second CD, also containing Miles from Nowhere, followed this almost immediately. In January 2002 came the limited edition vinyl release of the album, and in March 2002, the Fake Sound of Progress CD singles were released in their various configurations, with the demo of Happy New Year, Have a Good 1985 reappearing, along with the demo for Shoulder to the Wheel. The other track featured in all this was, of course, a cover of the Duran Duran James Bond single A View to a Kill, which was then the latest Bond movie, starring a worn-out-looking Roger Moore, who would soon be replaced briefly by Timothy Dalton. This cover version was the obligatory nod to the past and revealed the band's pop roots. No matter how hard you think you are, there's always a pop skeleton in the collective cupboard. This would bring further allegations of selling out and claims that nu metal was just another fashion-led branch of pop music. Drinking and smoking were by now considered so antisocial and old school that it began to look as if the scene's detractors might have a point. Wasn't the original idea of rock music supposed to be that getting old in safety and comfort was for wusses, and that the real contenders either went balmy or ended up dead? Well, whatever, that wasn't the case now. It seems the only rock casualties of the modern era were those who had to be admitted to accident and emergency, having cut their finger opening a tin of organic peach slices in fruit juice. In March, the band had duly picked up their NME Carling Award for Best Metal Act and did a run of Virgin Megastore appearances for more meet-and-greet opportunities with the fans. A week later, it was announced they would play the Irish leg of the 2002 Ozfest tour, playing support to Ozzy Osbourne, Therapy, Slayer and System of a Down. Not bad for 6 guys from Pontypridd, whose critics had always maintained that nu metal was for Americans and that they hadn't a chance of taking them on at their own game. Time would tell, and in the meantime, there was work to do.
Actually, we're filming an all new video before the end of December for Fake Sound of Progress, and that's brand new news and nobody knows. No, we don't invite any fans because we're bored of them now.
Oh, that is...
like I mean it.
Late in 2001, Lost Prophets had gone to Las Vegas to film the video for the Fake Sound of Progress single. In Vegas, they encountered the kind of surreal, dreamlike caricature of consumerist America that is hard to imagine unless you've been there and been drained of every penny you own. The kind of trashy opulence and indulgence that can only come from huge amounts of money being generated on a daily basis with no sense of apology or self-consciousness lies at the heart of the Las Vegas experience. If America is the land of golden opportunities, Vegas is the twisted, sick-hearted proof. Here, anything's possible if you've got the money, and if you haven't, better stay away. Making it big in the United States is the cliched dream of virtually every British teenage boy or girl who has ever picked up a guitar and learnt 3 chords, signed a disastrously exploitative recording deal and dreamt of power, riches and adulation beyond comprehension. Yet, throughout the 1990s and early in the 21st century, very few British bands had managed to establish a presence for themselves in the United States. The notable exception, perhaps, was Bush, who had worked hard, endured much enforced smiling for the cameras, and had avoided the kind of smug arrogance that undermines many bands' attempts to capitalise on their supposed strengths. Oasis had had a go at cracking America, but had proved themselves to be hopelessly amateurish, and possessed of a streak of willful self-destructiveness that was incomprehensible to audiences in America. Here, they expect committed professional entertainment delivered without shows of small-town prima donna angst. In America, Oasis had been a small fish floundering hopelessly in a very large pond. so much of English post-rock music was, deliberately or otherwise, parochial in scope, and locked in a kind of self-reverential irony that simply did not travel across the Atlantic. Even Radiohead, arguably the most influential British band of the 1990s, seemed to think that their spiritual home was at the newly sanitised, post-millennial Glastonbury Festival, which had become a kind of Glyndebourne for the 21st century college generation. Here, the trappings of affluent Middle England, the casinos and chilled Chardonnay tents had replaced its more traditionally libertarian atmosphere. In England's green, pleasant and socially and economically exclusive hills, Radiohead made their ritual appearance at an annual group therapy session to exorcise the existential angst of post-adolescent middle-class Britain. The UK simply could not compete on even terms with the American mall rat bands. If it was the sound of the suburbs, it was the sound of Illinois, Philadelphia, Seattle or Chicago, not Leicester, Hull, Bradford or Birmingham. Even though their early heroes had been the intercontinental musical weapons of mass destruction like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, The Who or Def Leppard, the new generation of post-rock wannabes simply couldn't cut it with the same verve, panache and appetite for life-threatening indulgence as these godfathers of rock. So when it came to Lost Prophets, it was hard to figure out what made them different, why they were being tipped as the next big British band, and the first for a long time to make it big in the mythical heartlands of America. They seemed unlikely to be the kind of guys who would be smashing hotel rooms or driving their white Rolls Royces into swimming pools. Yet on the other hand, it was clear they would not make the same mistakes as Blur, Pulp or Oasis and ground themselves willfully in the kind of Cool Britannia-style irony that was incomprehensible beyond the grimy shores of the Sceptred Isle. Perhaps it was their solidarity as a group of misfits and freaks who had broken out of the ultra-conservative small-town restrictions of life in rural Wales. Maybe it was their lack of pretension and smug self-regard, or their willingness to give 100% to their music, yet at the same time retain a clear sense of who they were and where they had come from. But most likely, it was the fact that their music had that sense of confidence and authenticity that had so impressed American audiences. Audiences who could pick at their leisure from an impressive roster of the best nu metal bands in the world, and who didn't really need a six-piece band from Pontypridd, unless they were pretty damn good. Yet the fact was that a year previously they had been just another bunch of aspiring rock musicians, out to do for money what they liked doing best in the whole world. And all the while running on optimism and adrenaline, sleeping on friends' floors and spending their food money on new strings for their guitars. Now, here they were, making a lavish video in the bad taste capital of the world, while all those around them tried to talk them into believing that soon they would be the greatest thing since sliced white bread. And maybe, just maybe, they were right.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Because gay guys get all the chicks.
No,
That's what I hear.
we're just very happy and we jolly.
So people call us gay.
Yeah,
Right.
kind of like a field in bloom.
We're the most hetero guys you'll ever meet. we go to wrestling and NASCAR.
American football.
And NASCAR's my favourite. It is. Bad Boys 2 is like one of my favourite movies ever, so I can't be gay.
The trouble with attracting a lucrative distribution deal from a company like Sony is that the kind of demands that are made of you can be creatively stifling. Lost Prophets had already had a taste of corporate policymaking when their first album was made over in the image of the kind of planetary pop product that keeps the bean counters at places like Sony Central affable and content. Unfortunately, this means that music tends to suffer the same kind of uniformity that afflicts fast food outlets. New bands tend to sound similar to whoever it was sold the most records last week. Production techniques become standardised in an effort to minimise the risks associated with anything so presumptuous as a new idea. Throughout the 1990s, the British music scene proved to be highly unpredictable and subject to dramatic sea changes almost overnight. At the beginning of the decade, it seemed as if the combined might of the emerging superclubs and mass availability of ecstasy would eat the civilised world. By 1994, rock had made a dramatic comeback with Oasis, and all the wannabe imitators spawned in their wake. They made boozing, sibling rivalry, and conspicuously bad behaviour fashionable again, undoing much of the work that the loved-up hug-drug generation had done to try and convince themselves that the world was a good place. Before long, the newsagents' shelves were rammed to the gills with lad mags, and alcohol was back in fashion as the drug of choice for the stressed-out young professional, with young women statistically outstripping men as binge drinkers. All this was reflected in the music. By the end of the 1990s, dance music was on the wane as the dominant soundtrack to the weekend. Ecstasy had been dumped as the weekend ravers' drug de rigueur, and booze and coke had shot to the top of the shopping list for social lubricants. By 2003, it was unclear where nu metal stood in all this. But it was becoming obvious that a staple diet of Slipknot, Korn, Limp Bizkit, and their many imitators was suffering a severe case of popularity disorder. The eclectic amalgam of rock, rap, hip-hop beats and scratching was gradually slipping from favour, to be superseded by more conventionally structured pop songs. This was particularly the case in Britain, where bands like Coldplay and Travis were making big names for themselves by trading on sensitivity and subtlety rather than aggressive confrontation. It was as if Nirvana had never happened, or rather that the lessons to be learned from them about the dynamic structure of rock music and ways to develop had been discarded or forgotten. Lost Prophets must have had to bear a lot of this in mind when working on material for their second album. In such a fast-changing world as the music industry, nothing could be taken for granted. When Nirvana were the biggest band in the world, they were still selling vinyl records as much as, if not more than, CDs. 10 years later, a band could no longer afford to rely on sales for hard copies of any kind, as fans were likely to be downloading their songs from the internet as buying CD singles, or burning copies owned by their friends. Much was expected of Lost Prophets. By being spoken of in such glowing terms by fans, journalists and industry insiders alike, they would need to be sure that their music was both authentic and commercial. They would not be allowed many false starts. If they misjudged the moment and slipped from grace, it would be a long, hard struggle back up again, and many before them had failed to make it back after a downturn in their artistic or commercial fortunes. By the time it came to begin recording their second album, they must have been aware of the pitfalls associated with this legendary, difficult phenomenon. First albums can come in many forms. They can come in a rush of confidence and creativity that can never be repeated. They can be the result of many years' hard work and hard-won inspiration, honed to perfection without the distractions of rapidly increasing fame. Or they can be relatively unfocused and immature, making use of all kinds of ideas that get junked when a band becomes more self-aware and professionalism begins to set in. All this can make a second album, for a variety of reasons, problematic to record. For Lost Prophets, it seemed to be a mix of all these factors. They said in interviews that their first album was rushed and cheaply recorded, a snapshot of where they stood as they embarked on their career as professional musicians. In point of fact, it had been essentially an elaborate demo, rather than a fully formed, carefully recorded statement reflecting their true abilities. The Sound of Fake Progress had been recorded in a week. Start Something, their second, took 10 months. Its title referred not only to the idea that anyone who finds themselves in a dead end in their lives should get on their feet and do something, anything, to improve their position, but also to themselves as they stood at that time. Since their first LP, they had had time to develop both their playing and songwriting skills. It was as if they were starting again, this time with the benefit of considerable hindsight. Hopefully, it would serve them well.
While plugging sites, do Dragon Ninja for cat. Yeah, DragonNinja.com is a site run by a cat. It's a really clever cat who can speak and do websites. It's our kind of like fan site, but it's not really. I wouldn't like to say fan site because that's quite patronising.
No, because it's
just
a lot better than our own site.
No, it's not.
Okay.
With 10 months to create their second statement to the world, Lost Prophets had plenty of time to think carefully about what they were doing. They could monitor trends in the industry and do their utmost to make sure that their record was as accurate as possible in showing a picture of who they were and what they could do. It is true that the right kind of production and relentless marketing strategies can give a mediocre band a short life in the sun, despite unpromising long-term prospects. But there is little that can be done to stop a band with intelligence, wit and good songs from getting an even chance of making it on their own terms. Lost Prophets had shown that they had all these qualities, and with luck, the right amount of support from their management, and with the might of Sony behind them, time should show them to be unstoppable. Much of 2003 was spent working in Los Angeles, with producer Eric Valentine taking the greatest care to make sure that the new album would be as good as it could get. There would be several departures from both their own previous methods of working and from the lyrical and musical concerns of many of their contemporaries. The massively increased budget that was lavished on these new recordings, compared to the £4,000 spent on their debut, meant that they could afford, for instance, real orchestral strings to add weight to their sound. The first single for the album, Burn Burn, was released on November 3rd, 2003, and went to number 17 in the British chart. Not bad for a band who the press were waiting to shoot down in flames, as is the tradition in Britain. Here, success is sought with manic fervour by anyone old and intelligent enough to crawl. As soon as they achieve the mythical status, they're slapped back down again. The lyrical subject matter of the album's second single, Last Train Home, was a call to be happy with whatever situation you were in, rather than wallow in self-pity and bogus angst, as much of the output of bands like Radiohead and Coldplay seem to want the listener to do. Or, if not wallow in their own sea of troubles, then at least spare a sympathetic ear for the poor millionaire songsmith whose life just won't seem to give him the jollies he so desperately craves. Lost Prophets would proclaim themselves in interviews to be too down-to-earth to fall for their own media-generated myths. They are essentially 6 very good friends who have found themselves more successful than they had ever dreamed was possible. Their tight bonds as people keep them reminded of what is actually going on in their lives. If, in the future, they fall for all the hype that will inevitably be written about them, then things may change. The media always prefer myths to the mundane truth, and the truth about Lost Prophets is that they are as amazed at their success as anyone, and are still basically 6 guys out to have fun. At the same time, they're gobsmacked at finding themselves being a top-selling British band, fetching up in places like Las Vegas or Los Angeles, which probably seemed, just 2 years ago, as unlikely as finding themselves falling off the planet, or perhaps more so. In an interview, Ian Watkins declared that Lost Prophets were one of the first British bands, if not the only, to be doing what they were doing. This might have been a problem for all sorts of reasons. In America, kids could choose from the top nu metal bands in the world. They had no need to import a nu metal band from a place like Wales. And in Britain, American music was often seen to be manufactured and marketed with little thought for originality or long-term strategy. Bands were not nurtured and guaranteed long-term careers. They were to be exploited while the going was good and dumped when the industry had taken what it wanted. Then it was on to the next thing. The perception on both sides of the Atlantic was that Lost Prophets had spent 3 years touring an album that was now beginning to seem a little naive and out of its time. 3 years is a long time in pop music, and during that time the landscape had altered dramatically. As always, most of the big moves were made in black music. Outkast had risen from their cult status as the Dirty South's most promising hip-hop act to become set to then rule the world with their quirky brand of melodic pop. It was no longer necessary to come on like an insecure neighbourhood gang leader promising to blow away any sucker who crossed your path. You could sing about love and admit to having a sense of humour, and it was all okay. Artists like Keyless had taken an avant-garde approach to chart music and had scored an impressive hit with her impressionistic tune Milkshake, and Pharrell Williams' hip-hop outfit Nerd were informing a new generation of fans who were comfortable with a hybrid of rock and black music. The message all over seemed to be that it was acceptable again to make this kind of music with live instruments. The sampler was no longer king. This should have been good news for bands like Lost Prophets, who were very much an authentic rock band with all the strengths and limitations that implies. It remained to be seen whether or not the world was sufficiently impressed with the steps they would next take.
cool. It was fun. People came out to shows and jumped around and we had a laugh. We just did an American tour. It's really, really cool. Of a different country. I haven't done with a twang.
Start Something was released on February the 2nd, 2004. They set out on a mini tour of Britain beginning in Glasgow on the 7th and finished at Cardiff University on the 20th. With a hit single and a brand new album under their belt, it remained to be seen what kind of reviews they would get. As it turned out, they were mostly positive. Even in Britain, where the legendary disdain of the music magazine hacks could be enough to make you wish you hadn't bothered, there was considerable interest. The NME enthused about the album's traces of soul and glam. These were elements that had been conspicuously lacking in British pop and rock for some considerable time. True, moaner bands like Travis and Radiohead exuded a kind of tragic self-pity, but that was mostly middle-class anxiety manifesting itself as the kind of bogus nonchalance that a good dose of Prozac would send scuttling off into the woods, never to be seen again. And a good thing too. There was a difference between dreary self-preoccupation and the outpourings of the soul. Soul was now, apparently, the reserve of a 16-year-old girl called Joss Stone, who was being paraded as the new Aretha Franklin. Times were surely hard, if that was the case. Nonetheless, it was at least real, and she could prove it by playing her songs live without the benefit of a bank of computers normally associated with operations at NASA to keep her voice in tune. Similarly, record buyers were now flocking to snap up CDs by artists such as the queen of hip easy listening, Norah Jones, as well as Katie Melua, Jamie Callum, even Harry Connick Jr. and Barbara Dixon. These were people who could all play and sing without the benefit of Svengali figures mapping their every move, every moment of the day. As for glam, it seemed to be that the darkness had opened a Pandora's box of retro possibilities. Hey, rock was fun again. You didn't have to be terminally depressed to make a chart-topping album. You could be ironic, you could have fun, and you could make people smile. If there was any vestige of glam in what Lost Prophets did, perhaps it harked back to their younger days, holed up in the doomy, dark wastes of Pontypridd, where they could take considerable flack from their peers because they dressed, not to conform, but to express their sense of isolation. They had strange haircuts and wore eyeliner. These were the traditional ploys of the suburban ugly duckling who wanted to send out the message that they felt uncomfortable in conventional situations. It had been a question of playing the weirdo card, or take that job at the Alliance and Leicester Building Society. Better than a good review in the British NME, though, were the reviews in American magazines, who had taken Lost Prophets on as an authentic British rock band with something useful to offer. And this was at a time when nu metal was suffering a crisis of identity of its own, with an album by Korn having proved less than successful and others finding their own fortunes taking a similar downward curve. VH1, the online music site, offered the observation that, whereas Lost Prophets had been initially derided for their slacker looks and dress sense, Ian was now being hailed as a sex god. Maybe this was due to a makeover in the style department, but when this was suggested, the band were incredulous. They barely had enough to pay the rent, let alone employ a stylist, a personal fitness trainer, a hairdresser each, and a yoga instructor. Maybe it was basic prejudice that discriminated against a band of newcomers inexperienced enough to defend themselves. Now, however, things were different. Lost Prophets had taken criticism on board and had gone away to reflect. They'd come back with a good album. So there. Presumably, though, this was what they were supposed to have done.
Reading last year. Yeah, it was really good. Because it was kind of like we'd been touring the UK for like a year, past in a van, just kind of playing anyway, you know. And we played Reading, and nobody really knew what we were, like, media-wise or promoters. So we were on the smallest stage and stuff, and people were like, oh, whatever. And just a load of people turned up to see us and stuff, and the barriers collapsed because there's so many people there. But and it was cool, and everybody's like, well, who are this band, and why are all these people here to see them?
In spring of 2004, at a time when the whole world is looking with some trepidation to the situation between America and what it considers to be the rogue Islamic states, It seems likely that this tension in society will show itself in works of art. Popular music is, or should be, no exception. There did not seem to be, however, quite the culture of protest and dissent that one might hope for, and perhaps that tradition belonged to another time. In the postmodern age, popular culture has become fragmented into so many disparate forms that it seems impossible to detect any unity of purpose. So what might the future hold for a band that has been in many ways hard to classify? Having achieved impressive popularity in a genre that is not only considered exclusively American, but also seen its popularity take a few knocks, it must be a strange position to be in. Perhaps the answer lies in refusing to be classified. If you can shake off the new metal tag, which was probably to some extent bogus in the first place, then you're no longer constrained by the expectation of fans who want their music to be, to a large extent, bound by convention. Everything in its rightful place, with boundaries clearly defined. In a conformist subculture, it must be difficult to know how to respond when something comes along that defies the conventions of your chosen musical tribe, yet nonetheless appeals to you on a more than casual basis. For Lost Prophets, such ephemeral problems will hopefully be of little concern. If the tag new metal becomes a limitation rather than a liberating influence, they would be wise to dump it altogether and simply become an entity in their own right. If boundaries are relaxed somewhat, it might be seen that all music is valid, whatever preconceptions one might previously have held. Music comes in two categories: good music and bad music. The rest is bullshit. The differences are marketing hype or the kind of tribal distinctions that keep people apart, rather than uniting them. The world no longer needs that kind of friction. When the future seems so tense, it might make more sense to relax one's inhibitions and simply have fun. Forget all the petty discriminations that get in the way of celebrating life. Hopefully, Lost Prophets will become part of that process.
Thanks for buying Maximum Lost Profits. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.